All right, hello everybody. I realize my glasses aren't on. Let me get those on. Good afternoon, friends. Today I am very fortunate to have a special guest with us, classical theist. He will be joined today with me to talk about divine simplicity. I'm very excited about that. So give a warm welcome here to classical theist. Hello, sir.
Hey, how's it going?
Let me just put this there. That way when people can see, let's see, I do this. Not really. Okay. I'm just going to do that. All right. I'm good. Thank you for coming on, being willing to just talk with me. Obviously, my audience they're fans of you, and obviously my channel I took a lot of inspiration from you. The opening, of course, very similar to
Yes,
classical
the
theist
infamous
opening.
the infamous rip-off opening.
Yeah. Yeah, so I very shamelessly took that from him. But as they say, imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. So I liked the style of it. And of course,
Yeah.
just in general, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just want to say, in general, classical theist has been a huge motivation for I think a lot of people to get into Catholicism and philosophy and Thomas Aquinas and a lot of those things. And so it's great having you, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, so thanks for the kind words. I'm glad that if I'm doing that, if that's sort of the effect of what I've sort of done over the years. Unfortunately, my content has kind of slowed down a bit, but I'm hoping to pick it up soon. But I'm really happy about that because that's really the intention for which I made a channel, which was to through metaphysics, through classical theism, to sort of bridge the gap between the philosophical theism and an interest in Christianity. So I'm very happy to see that a lot of people have kind of taken that trajectory.
Yeah, I'm so glad we have people like you who can do that. I know when I first got into philosophy, I was on like the agnostic, deistic side, and as I began
Same
to
here.
read into a lot of the classical thinkers, my thought began to change. So it's really good to put those arguments out there. I
Yeah,
think a lot of people don't realize their strength, and it's
I
been forgotten.
I began to be interested in Aquinas and Aristotle through ethics as an
Mm.
atheist, and I, for like a year or so, never made the connection between or I never even thought to ask myself, well, if Aquinas' ethics are so good, maybe I should think a little bit about, his metaphysical principles. I never thought that, but then gradually I began to think that, and that kind of led me to accept a more holistic picture of the world through ethics. So,
Right on, yeah. I'm going to put the entropy link in chat if you have questions for classical theists. Hopefully we'll get there. I know you can only stay for an hour. Hopefully we'll
yeah, well,
get
like
through
if
everything.
you want to just prioritize some of the like a couple questions,
Mm.
and if we do that, we could probably have time to answer some stuff.
Okay, yeah, I'll try to keep an eye on the clock. So just going into now, I know you've really specialized in divine simplicity, so maybe you could just explain to us in kind of layman's terms, or maybe define whatever philosophical terms you're going to use today. What is divine simplicity? Like, just give us like a general idea, a big like picture idea, so we know what we're talking about.
Yes. So divine simplicity at its core is essentially the doctrine that God, the ultimate source of all things, is not composed of any parts whatsoever, be they physical or metaphysical. And the reason this is a very important doctrine, some people might hear that who are maybe a little bit uninitiated, and they might think, well, why is that? What's the significance of that? Well, if you're going to maintain that God is wholly uncaused, that is to say, he is not dependent for his existence on anything outside of himself, he has no dependency on another for his existence, then we must also maintain that he cannot be composed of any parts whatsoever. And that's because uh, anything that is composed of parts, again, be they physical or metaphysical, and I'll explain that distinction in just a minute, but
Mhm.
if anything is composed of parts, that is to say, um, some whole, some unified reality is made up of um, constituent parts, then that means that there must be a causal relationship between the whole, or the unified reality, and the parts out of which it is made. And that's because if a thing's that's because the parts are always prior to um, the, at least in a causal sense, they're always
Mhm.
causally prior to the uh, the whole that
Mhm.
is made up of those parts. If the parts were not, if the parts were not making up the whole, then the whole would not be. Similarly, if the whole was not did not have reality, then the parts would be unintelligible as parts. So there's this mutual causal relationship between the parts and the whole. So you can't get out of this causal relationship between parts and whole in anything that is composed of parts. And so if God is going to be the transcendent source of all things that's not dependent for his existence on anything else,
Mhm.
then he cannot be subject to this causal relationship that necessarily flows from a thing being composed of parts. Now, I mentioned earlier that he's not composed of physical parts or metaphysical parts. Um, so physical parts, I mean, it's just, that's pretty easy to conceptualize. That would be like anything that is composed of, say, quantitative units of like corporeal matter, essentially. Um, anything that is measurable by quantity. Um, but if we're talking about metaphysical parts, that would be things that are composed of, be they form and matter, uh, act and potency, essence and existence. Um, the lack of those distinctions in God are really going to be uh, the most defining feature of what makes God God, ultimately. Um,
Mhm.
because if God is not composed of even metaphysical parts, then he really is wholly other than anything that can be conceived by a finite mind, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
So we are saying here the
and we
difference
can go through
between.
those if you want, like
Mhm.
the those metaphysical composites, and draw out the significance about how a lack of those distinctions in God, what significance that has for his his really his divinity, you know.
Mhm. Right. So, like a dog, its existence is dependent on its essential constitutive parts coming together. God's existence is contingent on nothing. He's all necessary. Therefore, he has no parts, both physical and metaphysical. And so, the difference between the physical and the metaphysical is kind of the same, if I'm understanding you correctly, as the difference between what people might call divine simplicity versus absolute divine simplicity, where divine simplicity is just more of a general, like God has no physical parts, whereas the absolute divine simplicity says that God is his attributes, right?
I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah, because if a lot of critics of divine simplicity who are also theists will obviously maintain with no hesitation whatsoever that God is not composed of physical parts. I mean, uh,
Yeah.
it's commonly understood that God is immaterial, that He's pure spirit, etc.
Unless you're
What
Mormon.
Yeah, unless you're unless you're a Mormon, I guess. Still trying to figure those people out, um, but what they will quibble with is this idea that God can also lack metaphysical parts. So and usually that the concern over that varies depending on who you're talking to. Like a lot of theistic personalists and Protestants who object to divine simplicity, they're a bit more concerned with how do you reconcile this this absolutely simple God with some some biblical language that seems to suggest that he can say undergo certain emotional states, which would
Right.
obviously imply that he's at the very least um, composed of various emotional or mental faculties, right?
Yeah, he's
Um,
like a personality.
yes, exactly, like a disembodied
Mhm.
personality. That's the sort of sense that I get from a lot of some of the Protestant criticisms of divine simplicity. And not to say that criticism of divine simplicity is like a marker of Protestantism, because a lot of Protestants, like traditional Protestants, accept divine simplicity, right?
No,
Calvinism,
absolutely,
Calvinists
yeah.
usually do, and such.
Dr.
But I'm talking,
Ortland, he accepts it.
yes, absolutely. But so that's on one side. The Orthodox, their objection to divine simplicity is a bit more interesting. I think it's a bit more respectable,
Mm,
um, because they're going to be a lot more concerned with how can divine simplicity be reconciled with the simultaneous transcendence and immanence of God. That is to say, how can we reconcile this idea that God is absolutely devoid of any parts whatsoever,
right.
or not really parts. I want to rephrase that. I want to rephrase that because the Orthodox deny that God has metaphysical parts too,
Mm.
at least on paper. um,
They have
so
their
I'm not
energies
I'm,
versus essence
right. I'm not by
distinction.
any means accusing them of saying that God has that essence and energy for them are parts of God.
Yeah.
Um, so I want to walk that back a little bit.
Okay.
But they're concerned with their quibble with absolute divine simplicity as articulated by Catholics, um, which is to say that I think the difference in with them is to say that we are going to maintain that uh, that the attribute well we're going to maintain that there are no um, real distinctions in God except for the distinctions between the persons. That's our position.
Right. Right.
They are going to maintain that there can be more real distinctions, and that is to say, for us. Sorry for explaining this a little bit
No,
poorly. I'm
no,
not in the
please.
best frame of
We
mind,
need to get all the details we can.
but yeah. So we are going to maintain that while there can be a real distinction between, say, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit,
Mm,
when we're talking about those attributes of God that are shared among the persons. That is to say, those attributes of God that that pertain to the shared essence of God.
mm.
Okay, we are going to say that, particularly as Thomists, uh, we are going to maintain that there is no real distinction between those attributes. And what I mean by a real distinction is that, say, the difference between divine goodness, divine wisdom, divine justice, the difference between those in God, uh, that distinction does not obtain except once the mind has considered the matter. So you don't want to get into the trap of saying that Thomists maintain that these distinctions are all synonyms, that they all mean the same thing in God. That's
Right.
not what
That
we're
was,
saying.
I think, planting one of Plantinga's objections is
Right.
that if you
Exactly.
say that God
Yeah.
is good and you say that God is
Right.
omnipotent, then you're saying that omnipotence equals goodness,
Right,
and they're
exactly. And that
one
does not
and the
follow
same.
at all because and St. Thomas addresses this, by the way. He
Mhm.
addresses this in the first part of the Summa where he clarifies that the doctrine of divine simplicity is not eunomian. Eunomius was an early heretic that was opposed by uh, the church fathers at the time, most notably by Gregory of Nyssa and Basil the Great. And Eunomius held that because the mind can have this direct understanding, direct knowledge of the divine essence, um, that all of these distinctions that the mind makes to get at, say, God's justice or wisdom or goodness, etc., those are just figments of the imagination. They don't actually mean anything except to serve as like synonyms, just different mental placeholders for the exact same meaning. And Eunomius was condemned, and St. Thomas is not a Eunomian. He's very clear that that's not the case. Okay, that that the distinctions between the divine attributes, um, there are meaningful distinctions. The difference is that um, because of God's infinitude, because God infinitely transcends the mind, um, all of these distinctions in their particular and distinct meanings will signify a reality that is one and unified and indistinct.
So
that
our minds, our temporal, corporal minds, create this distinction, which does not exist in the transcendent mind of God.
Right, but notably, the one important thing to point out is that so St. Thomas doesn't label this himself. The Thomistic commentators do, but they will call this a virtual minor distinction, meaning that the distinction between those attributes in God, the distinction, the actually making the distinction, comes after the mind's consideration, but it has a foundation in reality, so that it's because of God's transcendent, like supereminent fullness, that the mind cannot capture its entirety, and therefore must approach that unified reality that exceeds the capacities of our mind according to a plurality of finite concepts that each get at that reality in their own and unique way, thus preventing their synonymity. And yet, nevertheless, God is just too he's too rich to be subject to our distinctions. You see what I mean?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So there's
So that's
boundaries
the
with our
Catholic
language.
Exactly. Now, that's the Thomist view. Scotists are going to have a little bit of a different understanding of this, but not in a way that I think violates any of the ecumenical canons on divine simplicity that we have as Catholics.
And those are contained, I believe, in Vatican I.
Certainly,
And
Vatican I,
Florence?
yes. I'm drawing a little bit of a blank on the other canonical or conciliar. I think it is Florence. I could be wrong on that, but I think it is Florence.
I could be wrong. Yeah, definitely Vatican I.
Definitely Vatican I. Definitely Vatican I spells it out pretty clearly. But notice what Vatican I doesn't say. The Vatican I doesn't say you have to interpret divine simplicity along Thomistic lines.
It doesn't.
It just says that God is. It uses the phrase altogether simple. That's the exact phrase it uses. Altogether simple. Now the Scotists are going to maintain that. Even weak Palamites maintain that. So there is a lot more intellectual freedom for the Catholic when it comes to this issue than I think a lot of Orthodox tend to suggest. Like a lot of them seem to just pigeonhole us within the Thomist interpretation. Now I'm a big fan of the Thomist interpretation. I've defended it and I continue to defend it, but we're not limited to one school of thinking when it comes to this issue as Catholics. So if you're encountering like an Orthodox or something that throws objections to divine simplicity at you, and you don't know how to deal with them, and they come from the Thomist school, you can just push back and say, hey, I'm not limited to this school of thinking. Uh, I have a wide variety of interpretations of this doctrine that I can appeal to. So just be a bit self-confident in that, I think, is just an important
Oh yeah.
piece of advice for
And
people who are trying to engage in these discussions. I know I'm going all over the place, but
I'm sorry. No, the and the Eastern Catholics are in full communion with Rome, and they haven't had an issue with that.
exactly. Yeah.
So going to back now to the Orthodox, I understand
Yes.
they talk about the transcendence of God, His essence, and then is the
Yes.
immanence of
Right.
God, His energies, and how we
Right.
experience God. And
Right.
because there's this metaphysical distinction, therefore the idea that God is absolutely divinely simple, that He simply is His attributes, couldn't be true.
Right.
How
So
do you respond?
yeah, I think that's important. First, I might want to say a little word about some Eastern Church fathers on this issue,
Sure, right. We can go into the
because
fathers if you want.
it's. I mean, I'll address the philosophical objection in a minute. They usually don't make philosophical objections. They kind of, if you notice, but sometimes they do. Um, but so a lot of them are going to say that Dionysius the Areopagite, St. John Damascus, Maximus the Confessor, Basil the Great, that if you read their writings, all of them sort of affirm this distinction between essence and energies as interpreted by Palamas. And not only as interpreted by Palamas, but as interpreted by like this Neo-Palamite 19th century Russian Orthodox apologetic.
Right.
So,
Very Platonic and based on Hesychism, right?
yeah, and yeah, exactly. So that's kind of their claim. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, is that really the correct interpretation of these fathers? Now, I am not going to claim, and I think it would be foolish to claim, although, uh, let me put it this way, I think it would be foolish to claim merely assertively. We don't have the time to sort of hash out how I think a lot of these fathers are consistent with Aquinas' view, but be that as it may. Uh, um, I don't think that these Eastern fathers are articulating a position on simplicity that is inconsistent, particularly with the Declaration of Vatican I.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that a lot of the confusion is going to follow from a linguistic sort of divergence concerning the term essence.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll use a good case study with Dionysius the Areopagite and St. Thomas Aquinas, because they intersect in St. Thomas's commentary on Dionysius, which few people have read, where uh, Dionysius articulates sort of a proto distinction between essence and energies, which serves as the basis upon which Palamas makes his distinction. Palamas only makes this distinction because he finds it in Dionysius.
And when was Gregory of Palamas writing? So we
He like
get an idea of the
1300s.
chronology.
Yeah, so
1300s.
he's
Okay.
he's writing in 1300s. Aquinas obviously writing in the 1200s. Dionysius, uh, people might get mad at me, but probably 5th century. I don't know.
So early church.
Maybe he did know the Apostle Paul. I don't know, but yeah, Dionysius is gonna say that God in his union, so that is to say, as he is in himself, considered apart from his procession towards creatures. Does that make sense? Just that sort of way of phrasing things, because it's going to come up a lot when you read
Uh,
Dionysius, you'll understand.
So the way that we experience God, is that what you're saying? Is procession?
Yeah. So like that. Yeah, those are the processions that come out toward us. God turning toward us.
Like the rays
Uh,
of the sun hitting the earth.
exactly. Yes, and then that being distinguished from God as He is in Himself. Dionysius calls this the distinction between the divine unions and the divine distinctions. Um, Now that gets picked up by Palamas and he reads that as essence and energy. The problem is, if you if you if you can easily fall into a mistake, you can sort of transport the Western concept of essence onto this distinction, and the Western concept of essence has to do primarily with just the definition of a thing, right?
Mhm.
uh, you can transpose that onto this distinction, and you will kind of come away with this idea that God, what God is distinct from His energies, and if that's the case, that God, his essence, that is to say, His quiddity, uh, meaning what He
Right.
is different from His activities, and really distinct from His activities, then
It's a causative.
you have therefore introduced a distinction into the divine into the divine that the divine simplicity defender would not allow. Um, but if you interpret essence to mean something else, which I think is more likely, uh, because they use the word ousia, the substance, that's different.
And how does it
Because
differ exactly?
what that would mean, because when they use that term, that's talking about the inner being of a thing,
Ah.
which is not identically the same as referring to the definition of a thing, that whereby a thing is what it is, or the source of a thing's intelligibility. In other words, humanity and man.
Mhm.
That could be called substance if we're speaking loosely, but substance is more the underlying being of a thing, um, that which exists
Mhm.
simply.
So, like, essence would be, in the Latin sense, that man is a rational animal.
Yeah.
Substance
Yes.
would be like my particular being.
Yeah. You substance is sort of the subject of existence,
Mhm.
basically. Um, that which simply exists. Full stop. Um, so if you sort of use that concept, then you sort of read this distinction a little bit differently. It's more so that essence refers to God as He is in Himself,
Mhm.
considered apart from His relationship uh, toward us. And so, if you sort of interpret it that way, then when Palamas and others say that that the essence of God is one and simple and and indistinct, uh, but yet his energies are manifold and diverse and distinct. Well, then you kind of have to interpret that a little differently and say what's really being said is that God, as He is in Himself, is one, simple, indistinct, uh, without any kind of you know composed of no parts, etc.
Mhm.
But insofar as God proceeds outward toward us, He can be considered he can be thought of as multiple, manifold. Um,
And that's perfectly tolerable, is what you're
yeah,
saying.
exactly. And just to give you sort of a sense of why I think this idea is correct, you just have to sort of read Dionysius and some of these other Eastern fathers in context. And I think uh, I wish I had my copy of the of St. Thomas's commentary on the divine names. there's a really good quote in there that perfectly articulates what I mean. But let me just jump to Saint John Damascene, who is quoting Dionysius, and this is one of the early statements that Dionysius makes, and I think this is the prism through which you should understand what he says later about the divine unions and the divine distinctions. Let me just find it really quick.
And what book is this? That contains.
So this is here it is. Yeah, this is Saint John Damascene on the Orthodox Faith, Book 1, Chapter 10. But he's quoting Dionysius, so it's. I like this because it has Dionysius, but it also has sort of the testimony of an Eastern Father that comes after him. For those of you who don't know, John Damascene, it's either him or no, I think it is John Damascene. He's considered like the last church father, basically. So yeah, what he says is, all of the aforesaid names of God are to be taken as applying in common, in the same manner, simply, indivisibly, and unitedly to the whole Godhead. So, what that's kind of saying is that if we're thinking about these distinct names of God, these distinct attributes of God, that each signify the divine essence in their own way, right?
Mm.
Insofar as they signify the divine essence, they are signifying a reality that is one and whole and unified. Because the divine essence in its infinitude is so rich, metaphysically rich, that it is not in itself determined by any of our finite concepts. Those finite concepts manifest themselves from God proceeding outward toward us. But God's procession towards us is freely chosen by him. He's not dependent on us that he would be impelled toward this procession towards us. So a lot of sort of more Neoplatonic ways of talking about God might give you that impression that his processions towards us are these emanations that necessarily flow out of him. But that's not the Catholic way of understanding. It's not the Christian way of thinking. Because God freely chooses to proceed outward toward us, these outward processions have to be seen as posterior to God as he is in himself. Because God as he is in himself is perfectly happy without us. And he's perfectly complete and sufficient and real and full without us, without the world, without even consideration of the world, just within his own understanding of himself, within his own triune knowledge and love of himself.
Right, which is why there is a Trinity.
Exactly.
That
yeah, I mean,
love
that's why
good between two people exists already in the Godhead.
Exactly, and that's why the Son of God is not the world, right? The Logos of God is not the world. The Logos of God is his own consubstantial self-image that is fully complete and fully satisfied without anything else beside it. So I think this is sort of just a way that we can understand that these distinct attributes of God can be predicated of him and retain their distinct meanings, and yet in himself, insofar as they are understood finitely by the mind. And I think that's really the core of divine simplicity, if you really think about it.
Could you repeat that part where you said this is the core of divine simplicity? I really want to make sure.
Yeah. So it's like the core of divine simplicity would be ensuring that God as he is in himself is not limited by our finite conceptions of him. So he can be fully who he is in his infinite transcendence without being limited down by these these finite concepts that the mind directly apprehends. Divine simplicity ensures the radical transcendence of God. It ensures that He is untouched um, by finite concepts, and that He's fully Himself within Himself, without us, even as He chooses to proceed outward toward us, so that we might come to know Him under a plurality of finite concepts. But the plurality of finite concepts is due to Him proceeding toward us. He doesn't need finite concepts to proceed for His own inner processions. He, in a way, He gets that through the Son, and the Son is one. The Son is just the one logos.
And this really separates.
And to borrow from Maximus, to borrow from Maximus a little bit, he says that the logi, which are the logoi, which are sort of like the divine ideas that are sort of the exemplary causes of the things that exist in the world. He says they are in themselves the one logos. And I think that's sort of an affirmation of divine simplicity along the lines I'm trying to articulate now, which is that these finite concepts, these finite divine significations or predications, while they have their own distinct meanings in themselves, nevertheless they signify a reality that is one and simple and transcendent, and fully sufficient in Himself, with or without us.
And this very clearly makes Catholicism and even Christianity more generally very distinct from other religions that are more pantheistic.
Yes.
Where they stress the immanence of
Absolutely.
God. So it really protects the transcendence of God. And so they're very distinct from Mormons or other, even groups that think of an invisible God, like Sikhs or Hindus, because of they stress the immanence. They have forsaken the transcendence, and that's really protected in our Catholic.
It is right, because if God was not already, shall we say, if God was not already self-manifesting within Himself in a full and complete way, if His processions were not already complete within Himself, then what would that mean? That would mean that, because we know that God has processions because we exist, right? I mean, that's
right.
That's a truism that you can't get away from unless you want to deny your own existence. So, because we know that God has proceeded outward toward us, without the Trinity, what would that mean? That would mean that either, well, it's not really an either or, but it would mean that we are essentially the logos of God, but yet in this fragmented, just poured out into this fragmented, imperfect, fallen world.
And that's what the ancient Greeks thought, that the universe was the only begotten incarnate Son of God. Right. It was the universe.
Right. And to me, I mean, that kind of that debases God.
Right.
And you know what it also does is it also debases nature. Because conversely, when you have nature created out of an image of the image of God, then that raises the dignity of creation, because creation is not the be all and end all for itself. It is meant to. It is a manifestation of a reality that is infinitely higher, and so it sort of enables creation to participate in a much higher divine reality. So it actually, I think, um, our view has a much richer and higher view of nature than the other one. And I will also say that it 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 safeguards God's transcendence, because the logos of God uh, can be it can be pure and simple and one, without being uh, reduced to like fragmentation or distinction, or um, this fallen world. So I think it protects the dignity of God, and it protects the dignity of creation.
So, given that it protects the dignity of creation, should we all become eco-fascists?
Okay.
what is what? I guess that's a totally different question about the preservation nature and how we should treat it.
I mean, well, I'll say this much: like memes aside, I mean, I do think that um, you know, we should support, you know, conservationist policies, precisely or partly for this reason. And I think this is something that's not even like controversial for like a quote unquote conservative or reactionary to say. I think it's kind of just goes with the territory now.
It should, right? Yeah, it makes sense to me.
I don't think very many people even dispute it anymore.
I guess they might dispute whether or not climate change that fits in that category.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it does. I don't, you know, I'm pretty dismissive of that personally, but you know.
Sure. Maybe we can have another conversation about that, because I'm sure you've done a lot of research in a lot of these different areas.
I actually, well, when it comes to climate change, I haven't. I mean, I'm not qualified to talk about that, frankly.
Oh, okay.
But it's just my own little hunch. I'm not a scientist. I'm not.
Yeah, you're not a lab coat. No.
No, I'm not. I'm not.
And that's why we like you. I wanted to ask about how can we predicate to God? I understand that there's there's different ways. There's what I've heard is equivocally predication, univocally predication, and we can't do that. And maybe you could explain what those terms mean, and then how we do predicate things to God through either analogy or negation. Maybe you could unravel that concept.
Yeah, that really is quite a can of worms, because you wouldn't think so, but there is a lot of controversy of how one even interprets Aquinas on analogy among Thomists.
All right, maybe just stay like really surface level then.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I'm saying is
Okay.
I'm going to give a very sort of basic answer. It might not even fully cohere with my own interior thinking necessarily, because I think it's just such a complicated thing to unpack, just given all the different interpretations from the schools. But I'll give sort of just the standard basic presentation of it that's given by most Thomists. So because the divine names and the attributes of God are they both signify him, and yet they come from the mind's consideration. There is the relationship between God and these significations of God has to remain intact somehow, right? So if one were to say that the relationship is merely equivocal, well, then that means that there's no real relationship between creatures and the divine from that direction in particular, because we would also maintain that there's no real relation between God and creatures from his end, because we've already got done saying that he's fully transcendent and perfect within himself without the world, right? He didn't need to create the world. But there is a real relation between us and God. And analogy, the doctrine of analogy, helps to secure that intellectually. It helps make that intelligible. So when we predicate, for example, wisdom of God, um, what we're not doing is we're not speaking in terms of mere metaphor. So we're not saying that God is wise only after the notion of a metaphor, like as if the wisdom of God is the same thing as talking about how, you know, we
The
can
wisdom
speak
of
of
Gandalf or something.
yeah, or like even in the sacred scripture where it will, speak of, for example, the hands of God or something.
Yeah.
Um, if we were to approach predication, divine predication, in a merely equivocal sense, we would have to be committed to the notion that when we say God is wise, it's really no different than saying that God is angry, or that God has hands, or that God
He's
has
vengeful.
wings, or something like that.
Right.
Um, there is a real difference between these predications and the metaphorical predications. Uh, when we say that God is wise, um, uh, in the analogical sense, what that means is that there is something like wisdom, but not altogether um, synonymous with our finite conception of wisdom, that is in God as He is in Himself. And really, what we would say is that wisdom exists primarily in God and secondarily in us. So, uh, so God is wisdom itself, and our whole conception of wisdom is just a secondary participation in what exists primarily in God, and only
Oh, that's
secondarily
really
in us.
interesting. Okay.
So, and that kind of understanding it comes into play uh, much more directly when we're talking about like being and goodness. Um, God is being itself. God is goodness itself, and those perfections exist primarily in Him. He is the pure source of those realities, and we are only participated. Uh, uh, we only participate in a creaturely goodness and creaturely existence, and our entire conception of those perfections, while they do indeed come from us, and therefore considered as they are distinct from each other, say being and goodness, uh, they don't they cannot like just perfectly map on to God from our side of things, right?
Right.
Nevertheless, we do know that um, what they signify, what those perfections signify in reality, exists primarily in Him and only secondarily in us. So that's just kind of the general idea. You're going to want to study a lot more into this, unfortunately.
All
Uh,
right. So I'll
I
have
haven't
to.
been able to read into any of this stuff for like the
Mm.
past few months. I'm so busy, so I'm a little rusty on articulating some of these things. But I would recommend Being and Some Philosophers by Etienne Gilson.
I
I
have that
would
book.
recommend, excellent, yeah. I would also recommend Weipel's Metaphysical Thought of Thomas Aquinas, I think it's called. He gives a lot of the road Thomist in the sense that he's kind of neutral to the schools, the various schools. You don't want to jump into a school, so you don't want to jump into, say, existential Thomism by studying people like Norris Clark, and you don't necessarily want to jump into analytical Thomism, uh, and you don't necessarily want to jump straight into even um, uh, Thomists of the strict observance.
Mm.
You kind of,
Or
even though
transcendental Thomist.
I would just say don't get into transcendental Thomism. But I think, oh gosh,
Karan or
William Marshner had a perfect. Uh, he had a perfect way to phrase or to articulate what transcendental Thomism is. He said it's this perverse transubstantiation whereby the substance of Kantianism has the accidents of Thomism. So,
I love that because in my undergrad I studied Immanuel Kant. That was what I studied, so that's probably
yeah,
true.
yeah,
I want to transition now to going through
yeah.
some of the questions people have, if that's all
Sure,
right.
yeah. For the last 8 minutes, if I can't answer it, I'll just point you in the right direction.
Well, let's see here. This person says, Requiem, thank you, sir, for the super chat. He says, Hi, classical theist, thank you for everything you do. I was completely ignorant of philosophy when I was an evangelical Christian. So you and anime-ritis have greatly strengthened my faith with your work. God bless you. So it looks like your influence, your web
Thanks, man.
of influence is very extensive, classical theist.
I know, and I'm not doing anything with it lately. It sucks, but I've just been so busy.
Oh, well, we look forward to the next video. I know you're going to come up with one soon about the crisis in the church. I look forward to that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Let's see
Yeah,
here.
that's
Bean
gonna
Dip,
be a cold one.
Bean Dip says, thank you, Bean Dip. He says, Protestants are not Christians. That's my question.
Um,
So
so I wouldn't
take that
necessarily.
one.
Yeah, so I mean, I have to be a nuisance and reply to that with yes and no. I mean, uh, yes, that's true if you want to if you want to uh, identify being a Christian specifically with uh, being a uh, a member in full communion of his mystical body, and I think there is a proper sense in which you would make that identification. So, uh, in a purely objective sense, considered under that narrow definition, I would say that's true. However, I think you also have to recognize, and you can even find this in St. Robert Bellarmine and others, that there is such a thing as informal membership in the church.
Mm.
There is such a thing imperfect membership in the church. Uh, Baptism, precisely because baptism can exist validly in heretical sects, that necessarily means that people can be related to the church in various ways, even though they are not in full communion with the church.
Yeah,
In fact,
incorporated, right? I think there's
yeah,
sometimes the language there. They are
in
within the
fact,
church, but not fully incorporated through their baptism. And
right,
when they reach the age of reason, they would have to include invincible ignorance as well.
right, and in fact, I forget which pope it was, but preconciliar pope. I'm talking 18th century, I think.
Uh,
He he condemns the proposition that outside the church no grace is granted.
yeah,
So
I think that's like a Phenite position.
right. So I mean, I'm not accusing the questioner of being a Feniite, but what I am saying is that I think you have to understand membership uh, membership of the church in a little bit more of a nuanced way. It doesn't undermine the doctrine that there's no salvation outside the Catholic Church. That's still true, but there's a way to understand that allows uh, for imperfect grades of membership in the church. And I think one way to understand this is simply apply the criterion of mortal sin to being a member of the church, right?
Yeah.
Uh, there is such a thing as material sin, formal sin. To truly commit a mortal sin, you have to have full knowledge, full consent, and the matter has to be grave.
Right.
Well, that applies to either culpably or inculpably not being a full formal member of the Catholic Church. That has to apply because we're talking about a sin here. Sin is what severs one from the mystical body of Christ. Sin alone. That is to say, for those who are baptized, and even if they're not baptized, we're talking about original sin. so yeah.
All right, good answer. This Benster says, and thank you, Benster. I really appreciate it, man. He says, oh, this is from yesterday. He says, I'm sure Nezuko loved your 20-minute monologue, even though we couldn't hear it. Keep doing God's work. The last stream, it cut off. It abruptly ended, and I didn't realize it. So I was talking for like 20 minutes, and no one heard me. And Nezuko is the name of like one of the anime pillows that I sometimes throw in the background.
Yes.
I
sometimes forget you're an anime account just because of like how professional you present yourself in the video. And then I see the anime pillow, and I'm like, okay.
It's a weird balance.
I'm sure that juxtaposition is deliberate on your part, just as part of the bit. But yeah,
that's what people don't understand. Like, someone did like a whole hit piece on me about like how I like it.
Really?
It's like, yeah, it's part of the act. It's part of the irony of it all. But I do need to ask you though, on that vein, in the last few minutes, do you have a favorite anime?
Well, let me put it this way: I'm an ally of the anime avies. I just don't watch it.
All right, well that's huge. That's great news. We love to hear that. I'm sure my supporters will be very excited.
Well, long-time followers of mine know this. So.
All right, very nice. Maybe we'll give you some recommendations, but you're so busy. I mean,
I'm open to it. So.
Okay. All right. So thank you, Classical Theist, for coming on.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do it again when I'm not as when I'm less busy.
Right. Yeah. Well, I hope you can come back on. We can have some more conversations. We didn't cover everything, all of the questions I had, so we could do a part
I hope
two.
it was still useful, though. I know I went on some tangents that maybe not have been fully on point, but I hope it was. I hope you got some out of
great stuff. No, definitely. I hope my audience as well. I'm sure they did. Do you want to plug your channel? Would you like to plug your channel and your Twitter?
Yeah, so I mean, well, I'll say this. So it's just Classical Theist on YouTube. I'm somehow still on Twitter. Classical Theist without the T because it was taken, but specifically on Telegram, t.me/Classical Theist. That's where I'm posting more often than I do on other platforms. So t.me/Classical Theist is Telegram.
All right, so you heard him. Join the Telegram group. Follow him on Twitter. Also Gab, right?
Yeah, I have a Gab, Classical Theist. Classical_Theist is the @ I think.
All right, so he's Gab. He's got Twitter, and of course YouTube. That's where he posts videos. He makes great content, so make sure to check that out if you're not already. Once again, thank you, Classical Theist.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, man. Appreciate it.
So thank you, sir. I wish you the best of luck, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.
All right. So sorry to the people watching I know the stream cut out a few times. I apologize for that. Hopefully the recording is intact, so I'll try to get that uploaded as soon as I can. Thank you to those who super chatted. So strong thank you, of course, to Classical Theist for coming on. Thank you to Benster. Really appreciate it, man. Very generous of you. Thank you to Requiem. Really appreciate it. And Beamed It. And then also someone named 07, he subscribed. So thank you to them. I'm not sure how subscriptions work, to be honest. But thank you very much. I really appreciate it. 07. So 07 in chat to him. Yes, they answered your questions. They did. And they're all in the recording. I'm sorry for the tech issues. The internet, like I said, it's been really weird. It's been weird because right now it's working fine. and then sometimes for some reason it just crashes randomly, and then it like restarts the stream, or I'll crash, and then I have to try to figure out that. So I'm gonna try to recreate the recording from what I have. I think it'll be fine though. So thank you again to Classical Theist. He's great. We love him. Thank you to you guys. Love you guys. Thank you so much for the support you guys have given me, especially during this time period of my life. So thank you again to Requiem, BeanDip07, and Benster. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Let me end the recording here. So for the people watching, I hope to see you guys in the next video.